You unlock this door with the key of compassion. Beyond it is another world, a world of science, a world of common sense, a world of sanity. You're moving into a land of both empathy and ethics, of nutritional knowledge and empowerment. You've just crossed over into Dr. Osborne's zone. Dr. Davis, thanks so much for joining me today. I always enjoy talking with you. You're a pioneer in your independent thoughts, and we've come to a lot of the same conclusions, even through similar pathways, but also through very different. So thanks for joining me.
Always glad to be back.
So I'd love to just dive into what you're doing right now. I've read and we've talked about historically the L. reuteri bacteria, and I just want to get an update from you because I know you've been for the last several years really diving into that topic and have found some interesting things. So love for you to share.
It never ceases to amaze me the things this one microbe can do that virtually all of us have lost. So, as you recall, Lactobacillus reuteri is uniquely susceptible, as are many other lactobacillus species, are susceptible to common antibiotics. It could have been an antibiotic someone took 20 years ago, 30 years ago for an upper respiratory infection or for a urinary tract infection. But that round of antibiotics or the 10 you've taken since killed off all the Lactobacillus reuteri. And this was, it's the first microbe I played with seriously, and it's probably by just sheer dumb luck, probably the most important. There are many important microbes, of course. You can't live with one microbe alone. You need thousands of different species. But this one has such a crucial role. It's clearly what's called a keystone species. That is, it's foundational. And restoring this one microbe that we've all lost encourages proliferation of numerous other species. But I think we're seeing two different things with the restoration of reuteri, two general categories of benefits. One is it sends a signal to your brain once it takes up residence in your gastrointestinal tract, sends a signal to your brain to release the hormone oxytocin, which people often recognize as the hormone of love and empathy. So you do get an intensification of the feelings of affection for other people, of tolerance for people like their coworkers and their families better and their spouses better. People accept other people's opinions more readily. But I also call it the hormone of body composition because it reshapes your body. You get a restoration of youthful muscle and selective loss of abdominal fat, for instance. So there's that collection of effects. But there's another aspect of reuteri that's proven to be very interesting beyond just provocation of oxytocin, and that is it takes up residence in the small intestine where it produces what are called bacteriocins, natural antibiotics effective in killing fecal microbes. Now that's important because half the US population has allowed the excessive proliferation of fecal microbes. These are species like E. coli and Salmonella and Klebsiella. So those microbes have overproliferated and then remarkably ascended into the 24 feet of small intestine. Small intestine is ill-equipped to deal with that. And so when that happens, those microbes live and die very rapidly. They live only for a few hours, and they release their toxic components when they die. That's called endotoxin. That gets into the bloodstream, and that's called endotoxemia. This is a modern phenomenon. And so there's at least a 200 to 400% increase in this level of bacterial endotoxin. And that's what's driving obesity. It's a major driver. There are other factors, of course, but it's a major driver: obesity, abdominal fat expansion, high blood glucose, depression, suicide, anxiety, skin rashes like rosacea and psoriasis and eczema, in autoimmune diseases, in neurodegenerative disorders like cognitive decline and Alzheimer's disease and Parkinsonism. In other words, all these modern common conditions were either initiated or made worse by this process that begins with microbes in the small intestine. And reuteri is a big first step in pushing them back.
So it's a protective species. What do you think? You mentioned antibiotics, even early in life. Is that what as a doctor, a clinician, is that what you suspect is really driving the deficit, or is there something bigger, broader?
There probably is, except it's not been properly mapped out. Could chlorinated water be a factor? Could glyphosate and other herbicides be a factor? Could emulsifying agents or synthetic sweeteners like aspartame? Probably, but the evidence has not been backtracked. One of the problems is because it's disappeared, essentially. It's been hard to test. So the microbiologist who first discovered Lactobacillus reuteri back in 1962, so 60 some years ago, he found it everywhere. Back then, Dr. Gerhard Reuter said it's easy to find. It's in breast milk, breastfeeding moms. It's in stool. It's in other body fluids. And his 40-year academic career went on, and he kept on saying as his career advanced, it's getting harder and harder to find this microbe anymore. By the end of his career, about 20 years ago, he said he could almost not find it at all. And that's been corroborated since by several other groups that Reuteri essentially disappeared. Very few people have it anymore. And we've lost all these advantages, So think about this. So if we've lost Reuteri and thereby oxytocin, the hormone of love, empathy, and companionship, is that why we have record social isolation pre-pandemic, record suicide, 35% increase in suicide in the last 20 years, and more so with the pandemic? Of course, half of all marriages now end in divorce. And the rise of narcissistic behavior. I didn't know that the psychology community has been formally measuring and tracking measures of narcissistic behavior since 1963. So they have these questionnaires that pose questions that identify you as having narcissistic behavior or not. Questions like, true or false? I am a very important person in this world. In, in 1963, 13% of people said, oh, yeah, that's true for me. In our time, it's more towards 83%. Now, there's probably other causes, maybe consumerist society, social media, but you and I can't do much about those things, but we can restore this microbe. And I'm seeing it play out. People who restore this microbe say, you know, I introduced myself to strangers in line for coffee at Starbucks. I like my coworkers, but yeah, they annoy me. But you know what? I accept their behavior. Or, I find that even if somebody has an opinion different than mine, I say, I understand why you see that. I don't agree, but I understand. And so I'm seeing a shift in behavior. I had a doctor recently say to me, he said, you know what? My wife says to me, what's going on with you? You're always asking me for hugs. And he says, he needs her companionship. He needs her closeness. And I'm seeing this play out in real life. So, for me, yeah, it's great. All the effects of Reuteri, reduction endotoxemia, restoration, youthful musculature, smoother skin. The ladies love that. Increased libido, a restoration of youthful vaginal moisture, a rise in testosterone in the guys. Those are all great things. But I think the most important thing that comes out of all this is the increase in empathy and generosity.
Yeah, especially in today's world, it's become so polarized. The message has been tolerance with an intolerant attitude if you're not. And so it's really been a strange last 10 to 15 years, probably even a little bit longer than that. So you're seeing these things clinically. So let's back up a minute because you've said a lot of things. Are you seeing these changes in your own? Because I know you're not in private practice anymore. But you're doing some or attempting to do some research and working with some individuals, correct?
Like you, I have a large audience and I interact with them. For instance, every Wednesday night, I have a 2-hour Zoom. And we talk about these kinds of things and we get lots of great feedback. And there's a larger audience, of course, who shares their experiences. And we are seeing these things play out on a large scale. But I think we could take it farther because even though there's a lot of people in my audience and your audience, there's still lots of people who've never heard any of these things, but who could benefit hugely. I think of all the people who are struggling with anxiety, unhappiness, lack of well-being, low self-esteem, self-hate, hatred. By the way, so even beyond Reuteri, one of the things I'm seeing is SIBO-CIFO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, small intestinal fungal overgrowth, also epidemic. Both of those things are wildly epidemic. And they're major drivers of anger, frustration, hatred, I've seen it play out. This is not well documented, by the way, in the science, but I see it play out. Someone will say, you know what? I hate my life. I hate my spouse. I hate my family. I hate my coworker. They're filled with hate and anger. And I see it recede by addressing the microbiome. You know what? If you had said to me 20 years ago, hey, Bill, I think you get a lot of mileage at addressing people's microbiome because all the angry, dissatisfied people in the world would get better, I'd say, I don't think so. I think so now.
Yeah. So what got you into L. reuteri in the first place? Because I mean, it just like I said, there's thousands and thousands of microbes in the human gut. I mean, and to land on that one, was it clinical experience seeing that particular strain do better than others? What kind of started this story for you?
I don't remember exactly. I was thinking about oxytocin, that hormone, and there's a very interesting line of work. It's kind of creepy, though, from a woman, a researcher at Stanford and then at Harvard named Irina Conboy. Conboy. And she was doing a series of experiments called heterochronic parabiosis. Hetero, different, chronic time, para next to life. So really weird. But what it was, they took old rats. This is really creepy. They took old rats, cloned them so that they had now have a young rat who's immunologically and genetically identical, and then connected their circulatory systems. Really creepy, like Frankenstein
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
And the old rats became young again.
Hmm.
So they asked, what's the mediator of these effects? Well, it's a work still in progress. But the first thing they identified was oxytocin. Other peptides, oxytocin is a peptide, but other peptides have since been isolated, but they often don't have names. They have like number designations, XYZ123 or something like that. But it was oxytocin that was the first. And then there was a series of experiments also done by her group where they gave oxytocin to animals and saw some of the features of youthfulness return. So, for instance, if you take an old mouse that has atrophied muscle and you give it oxytocin, it develops muscle that is indistinguishable from young mice. So, like mice, humans, as we age, we lose a lot of our muscle. We get skinny arms and legs, and we get fractures, falls, and frailty. Well, so in animals, you get a restoration of youthful muscle. And then an MIT group, unrelated to Irina Conboy's group, stumbled on some other effects of oxytocin. They didn't know what it was at first. They just gave mice Reuteri in their drinking water because it's known that Reuteri has very powerful anti-cancer effects. Colon cancer and pancreatic cancer has not been explored in humans yet, only in mice and cell cultures. So they gave a bunch of mice L-Reuteri, and they started to see things they didn't understand. They saw that their hair became thick and luxuriant. They saw that their healing was accelerated dramatically. They saw their immune responses improve. They saw mating behavior. That's sexual behavior among mice. There's mating and grooming. They saw old mice not getting old. They stayed young, like Irina Conboy's crazy experiment. And they just said pretty much, well, there you go. Isn't that interesting? So I saw this. I got the same microbe they were playing with, and it was available at the time as a commercial product for infants. So the dose was inconsequential. So I asked myself, well, how can we increase the microbial counts? Because if you bought the product, you'd have to take 100 tablets a day.
Mhm.
Impractical. So I just fermented it to amplify bacterial counts as a yogurt. It's not yogurt, it looks and smells like yogurt, but and we increased microbial counts. We counted the microbes. We get about 300 billion per half cup or 120 milliliters serving. And I just started talking about this with my audience, and thousands of people have been doing it. This doesn't often happen, where phenomena seen in mice translate into humans. Most of the time that falls apart. Things we see in mice don't apply to humans. In this case, everything that was seen in mice, to my great surprise, has played out in humans. A return of youthful musculature, rise in testosterone, increased libido, increased generosity, acceptance. All these great effects have played out in humans. And so, and since then, we've learned a lot more about Reuteri and other microbes. We also Reuteri tends to collaborate with other microbes for other beneficial effects. But so I don't even remember how I got started, but it was those crazy heterochronic parabiosis, creepy experiments that kind of got me all excited.
Well, that's interesting. So oxytocin really sounds like it's one of the main mechanisms of action then is just the increase in oxytocin. Is that have they parsed that into kind of like, microbiome responsible for generating serotonin and dopamine? Is it kind of a similar the peptide oxytocin is produced by these bacteria, or is it just that there's a stimulatory cascade that allows for the increased production of oxytocin, or do we know?
So we know some things from the MIT group. There's a group at Baylor have done some work. There's a group at one of the University of Texas campuses that's done some work. So there's been a fair amount of work. We do know this. So Reuteri takes up residence in the GI tract. It exerts a peptide on the intestinal, it's called resistant, on the intestinal wall, and then it sends a signal via the vagus nerve up through the chest, neck, and to the brain. And it causes the hypothalamus in the brain to release oxytocin. So a lot of the effects are achieved that way. Then there's some other effects exerted via the immune system, various T cell subsets. So there's still lots of pieces missing, but those pieces are known. If we clip the vagus nerve, as the MIT people did, the whole thing is blocked. So that much is pretty. So the so-called gut-brain axis is part of all this.
Yeah, so the vagus nerve is key, at least in mice, in terms of inducing these beneficial effects. And so you started creating a yogurt. We talked about this last time. Having people make their own yogurt, and they're coming back to you reporting all these wonderful changes. So let's talk about, kind of just from top to bottom, what are some of the biggest things that your community is reporting back to you?
Well, the ladies go nuts because they're always concerned about their skin. And so the ladies are reporting a reduction in skin wrinkles, particularly the fine ones like crow's feet and smile lines. Over a longer period, the deeper nasolabial fold, forehead wrinkle, those require greater volume of collagen in the dermis. Those take longer. The fine ones take about 90 days. Youthful muscle tends to return the first 4 weeks. I'm a chronic insomniac, and I've all my life I've struggled to sleep. Now, deep restorative sleep, vivid childlike dreams, flying, showing up in the school play, not having rehearsed your lines, all that kind of kid stuff comes back. For me and for many other people, a restoration of youthful musculature. So this was going back a number of years in my early 60s. I gained 13 pounds of muscle and my strength increased by 50% over 3 weeks. And I don't know about you, I hate going to the gym. I can't stand it. So I would go 15 minutes tops once a week, and yet I gained 13 pounds of muscle and a marked increase in strength. I don't think everybody gets that magnitude. What I think I'm seeing is people who had more muscle in their youth get a return of more muscle. So if you're a long distance runner and didn't have a lot of muscle, you might not get the same effect. But if you were a track kid or football or weightlifter, you'll get a lot more muscle. So we're seeing that. We're seeing a rise in testosterone. The ladies are reporting a rise in libido. They're also reporting the older ladies who lose vaginal moisture and sensation, it comes back. There's a suppression of appetite specifically for snacking, so-called hedonic eating. That is snacking just for laughs, not for sustenance. That seems to go away. Um, in other words, so smoother skin, youthful musculature, restoration of youthful hormonal levels. I think what we're seeing in many ways is turning back the clock 10 or 20 years. And you see it on people's faces. They look younger. They act younger. I've got people in my audience. They say, I'm 84 and I ride my mountain bike and I pass the 35-year-olds. So I believe that's what we're seeing.
Have you documented any of these? I mean, are any of your audience members documenting, like, are they going to their doctor like pre-post, testosterone went up X? Have you documented anything as far as like raw numbers at all?
Well, the waist circumference, so we get about a reduction just short of 3 inches on average in waist circumference, as much as 8.5 inches over 90 days. We did a small series in 20 guys over 55 and saw a 50% rise in testosterone. There's so much more to explore. We have a body composition study I'd like to get done hopefully next year. Budget permitting, we're not pharma. We don't have billions of dollars to spend. We have a few $100,000 to spend. So we'll do a body composition, either DEXA or bioimpedance, to document, quantify just how much muscle returns in most people. Anecdotally, we're seeing something like 7 to 8 pounds in ladies, a little bit more in guys. So ladies get mad at me sometimes. They say, "Hey, I did your Reuteri in the program. I gained 8 pounds." I'll say, "Well, did you look at your in the mirror? What happened to your waist?" "Oh, my waist is smaller." "What happened to your shoulders and your neck and your thigh?" "Oh, I'm more muscular, I'm more firm." So we're seeing that play out anecdotally, but there's still lots more to document. I'd like all my future studies will also include psychological profiling for measures of empathy, generosity, and well-being. Because I think that to me is the most important thing we do. It's great to have youthful muscle. It's great to have higher testosterone and libido. But if we can have an impact on social behavior in a positive way, that I think is really cool.
Yeah, no doubt. Especially in today's times, it's gotten a lot more animalistic out there in the world. At least that's my personal experience. My wife talks about it all the time. She's really frustrated with the world. I think just because she felt like she used to could like walk up to strangers, like you were saying earlier, walk up to strangers, say hello, introduce yourself, have a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And she says all the time, I feel like that's just left the world. Like people are so on guard and they're just so, standoffish and they're just so quick to anger. And that's super, super frustrating to try to navigate the world when it's responsive that way. That's interesting to me. I think, a bacteria that has the potential to create human empathy. I mean, wow. I mean, if that pans out to be accurate, and we can validate that scientifically, that's a major world game changer, in my opinion.
So yes, we've co-founded a company for making products, but I also co-founded what I call the Natural Biosciences Research Foundation to fund some of this research that doesn't yield profit. If we make people happier, there's no money to be made by that. But it's something we need to do. As you point out, humans have always been an angry, violent species all throughout history. But I think as you and your wife have noticed, I think it's worse. And even just common polite social interaction has kind of fallen apart. But I see it coming back. All these people who say, I really like my spouse better now. I want more hugs. People at work say, don't hug me anymore. I mean, I'm seeing it return. I'm convinced there is a real effect here, but we'd like to quantify it.
Yeah, and wouldn't it be great to get published data? That to me, that's where you get next scale level of uptake. Humans. And then more researchers come on board and do more studies to validate, and then you have the information that can go and spread far and wide because this is the natural industry is already up against, as you mentioned. I mean, you're up against big pharma, and they don't want this stuff. Like I've been involved in I don't know what your career path has been like. Well, I know some things that you've shared with me, but like my own personal career path, I have been in 3 or 4 different situations where information where I was involved in some research or I was asked to be involved in some research or I was trying to figure out why lab reference ranges were radically changing on some of the labs that I was using. So I would reach out to lab directors and it was amazing to me how corrupt some of these changes and why these changes were made. And to me, it felt like it was a direct assault on trying to minimize the power that nutrition can have to help humans so that not for the sake of making pharmacy better, but for the sake of making nutrition less appealing, so that people would just abandon it for pharmacy. And even talk to one gentleman who said, "Yeah, that's what we're doing. That's what we're attempting to do." So, but to have other scientists and have a research company that can actually validate findings like this and then share it. Because I mean, today's beautiful because we have social media. You've got like your own group, and I've got a group, and information is instantaneously shared across platforms, and in moments you can reach millions of people without any kind of media suppression or other suppression. So to me, this is great.
That's why what you're doing is so important. I hope what I'm doing also, because, people have to turn to people like you and me via podcasts, YouTube, etc. It's not coming through major media. You won't hear this on ABC, NBC, or CBS or cable news. You won't get it from most doctors, sadly, most mainstream doctors. John Q. Primary Care doesn't know anything about Reuteri or hormones or nutrition or the microbiome, and they should. In fact, I think they've abdicated their responsibilities by not doing so. But that's why what you're doing is so important.
Well, you practiced cardiology for 25 years, right? I mean that, and I mean traditional cardiology. And then what clicked for you? Like, what was that pivotal moment where you just said, "I think we need to do some things differently"?
It was when my mom died of sudden cardiac death 4 months after her coronary angioplasty in New Jersey, where I grew up. And that's the thing. I was doing the angioplasty, atherectomy, stent implantation, doing it every day, morning till night. But it drove home to me just how inadequate what I was doing. And you know what? It was a very exciting time. It was the 90s, and this was the Wild West of heart procedures, and we were doing all kinds of crazy new things. And then here my mom dies of, and so I asked, and wait a minute. So what I'm doing is grossly inadequate. And I asked, what could I have done for my mom? A year, 2 years, 5 years ahead of time to have given her warning. Where, of course, the conventional answer is stupid. It's look at her cholesterol, which tells you nothing. It should have been abandoned decades ago, but it makes much money for the pharmaceutical industry. Most of our colleagues cling to this ridiculous idea that cholesterol reduction reduces heart disease risk. Of course, it's ridiculous. It does not. Statin drugs are an absolute waste, despite having made hundreds of billions of dollars for the pharmaceutical industry. And so it was that. And then I started getting involved in this is back 35 years ago. This is a long time ago. Back then, it remains largely true today. If your patient says, "Hey, my dad had his first heart attack at age 56. I'm 51. Is that in my future?" And you say, "Well, your cholesterol's fine, or it's too high, we'll give you Lipitor." Those are meaningless. But they have a coronary calcium score or a CT heart scan to generate a coronary calcium score. That's still a very excellent test. It's been around for over 30 years. I set up one of the first ones in the Midwest, first one in Wisconsin, 30 some years ago. And it tells you when you look for hidden heart disease in people who are going to work, riding their bike, going whatever, you find it everywhere. Unfortunately, what my colleagues are looking for is not early heart disease they can't do anything about. They want heart disease that leads to procedures like heart catheterization, stent implantation, atherectomies, bypass surgery, implantable defibrillator, all that kind of stuff, because that's where the money is. And that's what the problem in cardiology in particular. It's among the most cutthroat, money-hungry professions there is. And as I saw this, and I saw how ineffective there's a time, if you're having a heart attack, you need a procedure. But if you're just going to work and feeling fine, you don't need a procedure. And by the way, it's still done every day. A lot of my colleagues are unscrupulous, and they'll take nice people who just have no symptoms but have some measure of hidden early heart disease, and they'll put them through procedures because they use fear. This is true not just in cardiology, but in general in healthcare. They use fear. Fear of cancer, fear of dementia, fear of heart disease, fear of death. And they'll use that as the leverage to get you into the hospital for procedures or some other test. It shouldn't be that way. People should be empowered to take care of their own health. The doctor should be the benign guidance for that. But unfortunately, that's not true for the vast majority of mainstream physicians. But this is, once again, this is why what I think you're doing, what I'm doing, Hope, is so valuable, because people need to hear these things, because it's not coming from conventional doctors, and it's certainly not coming from the media.
Maybe if you took some L-Reuteri and made it freely available to the medical profession, maybe some of that fear would strikingly become greater empathy and love. And I mean, maybe that would be a partial solution.
We're trying. We're trying.
So that's interesting. So just your own. I love that. I mean, most of the I use the word functional. I don't like that word because I mean functional medicine is the kind of the buzzword of the probably the last 10 years of it used to be alternative medicine and integrative medicine, and they just keep changing it. The marketing just keeps changing around it. But in my opinion, it's really just doctors who have great empathy, who have great curiosity, and who just want what is best for the patient. And so they're willing to do things that maybe aren't part of a standard of care. They're willing to look differently and ask different questions. And most of I'm not a medical doctor, I'm a chiropractor by trade, but most of the medical doctors I know that get into this realm are cardiologists. And again, I don't know, well, maybe choosing to go into cardiology is heart centered. Maybe I don't know, but I just find that interesting. That's just my own observation of people that I know in my world. Um, so let's talk more about Reuteri because there's some other. I want to backtrack to some questions that I didn't get to ask on it, and that is dosing. So you're seeing again increases in skin thickness. You're seeing reduction in body weight, reduction in waist size circumference, increase in lean muscle mass or youthful muscle restoration. What kind of doses are we talking about here? 5 billion, 20 billion, 100 billion units?
One of the great holes in the entire world of the microbiome is lack of formal dose response evidence. So, for instance, there's a very nice study using another microbe, Lactobacillus gasseri, and they were looking at waist circumference. So, placebo, no change, no surprise. 1 billion per day, no change in waist circumference. 10 billion per day, 3 centimeters, about an inch and a half of waist circumference. No change in diet or exercise, just take gasseri. Well, if 10 billion achieved 3 centimeters, what would 50 billion do? What would 100 billion, what would 500 billion do? So we don't know. So because those kinds of added arms, we say, to these clinical trials adds a huge amount of cost, and we're not pharma. We don't have billions of dollars to spend. And so what I think is going on is with the products I formulated have the Gut to Glow has 40 billion in 4 capsules. My Reuteri has 10 or 20. There's two different products, billion. And those seem to be generating a lot of positive effects. I don't think they can do, though, is one of the effects of Reuteri, because it colonized the small intestine and produces bacteriocins. And so you can push back SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. But I think that requires higher counts. So one of the options that people have is to take either of those products and make yogurt out of it. It's not yogurt, looks and smells like yogurt. It's not the stuff in the store. So we used my method of prolonged fermentation. So if you buy yogurt in the grocery store, different microbes, one. Two, they use very brief fermentation times, 6 to 12 hours. Well, Reuteri doubles every 3 hours at human body temperature. So if we did it for 6 hours, you got nothing. So we're going to ferment it for 12 doublings or 36 hours. And when we count the number of microbes, it's about 300 billion per half cup or 120 milliliter serving. And I think those are the numbers that stack the odds in favor of eradicating SIBO. But you can even go further. So I asked this question with SIBO because it's everywhere. It's everywhere. So if you took a commercial probiotic off the shelf for your SIBO, because you're having fibromyalgia, restless leg syndrome, food intolerances, depression, anxiety, whatever, all those things are all SIBO related. If you took a commercial probiotic, will the SIBO go away? No. So what if we chose instead microbes that colonize the small intestine? Very few do that. And microbes that produce bacteriocins, effective in killing fecal microbial species. So I chose Lactobacillus reuteri, our friend, Lactobacillus gasseri, very similar, small intestinal colonizing, bacteriocin producing. And I've debated how necessary the third one is, which is currently Bacillus coagulans, but similar. It's a spore former. It germinates in the ileum, the distal small intestine, and produces bacteriocins. Well, so we either co-ferment them together, all three. One of the things we don't know when you co-ferment multiple species, what happens with each subsequent batch made from a prior batch. We've not done that analysis. We will do that. In other words, if you start with, let's say, your microbes and then you ferment for 36 hours, you probably have some in the order of 100 billion of each of those three. But what about the fifth batch or the 10th batch made from some prior batch? Because microbes compete with each other, and there may be shifts in the relative numbers of each. So we've not done that analysis yet. Some people, to get around that, they individually ferment each and eat a little bit of each rather than co-ferment them. But either way, we're seeing 90% of people normalize their breath hydrogen gas. That's how we measure SIBO. I don't have it here. I'm in the office right now. But if I was at home, I'd show you the AIR device in case your listeners don't know about it. It's a little consumer device that measures hydrogen gas in the breath. You don't need to do that, but it can be helpful to measure hydrogen gas. It's a device that essentially you can use to map where microbes are living in the GI tract. Are they in the colon where they're supposed to be, or are they in the stomach, duodenum, jejunum, and ileum where they don't belong? And you can use that device to measure. And by using that device, 90% of people who've done this SIBO yogurt idea have normalized to normal breath hydrogen gas.
That's fantastic. I mean, I think the traditional treatment for, positive gas test is rifaximin, antibiotics. And as we started this conversation earlier, antibiotics are potentially one of the reasons why we see an absence of Reuteri in the first place. So,
Exactly.
and other species as well. But that's interesting to see that it always goes back to that, doesn't it? It's something natural, something that should be there that's not there, creates a downstream effect that leads to a diagnosis, that leads to medical treatment that oftentimes caused the problem in the first place or contributed to the problem in the first place. It's like a never-ending cycle. So you're seeing SIBO and SIFO improve as a result of it. Is it more of a combination of the two, the Gasserai and the Reuteri?
I think so. We have had a lot of people get rid of their SIBO by H2 breath mint just with their Reuteri, though it seems to take longer we usually use it for 4 weeks as the SIBO yogurt. With Reuteri alone, it seems that a lot of people seem to get relief also if they take it over an extended period, like 8+ weeks.
Okay.
And it's just a yogurt. And by the way, I kind of regret calling it SIBO yogurt because it sounds like it made it sound as if it's only useful during SIBO when it's actually restoring microbes that we should have had all along anyway because it has such spectacular positive effects. So even after somebody eradicates their SIBO, maybe their food intolerances go away, or the fat malabsorption, fat droplets in the toilet goes away, or their restless leg syndrome goes away, or their fibromyalgia goes away. I still encourage people to consume the yogurt, or at least the Reuteri, several times per week, 3 or 4 times a week, chronically for the rest of your life, because it prevents recurrence, at least until we figure out how to make it take up long-term residence or permanent residence. That's one of the fundamental questions we don't have answered. That is, if mom gave us Reuteri at birth, by passage through the birth canal or breastfeeding, we'd have Reuteri for a lifetime, barring exposure to antibiotics and other factors. But when you get it through yogurt or probiotic, it's present for a few days, maybe a week or plus, then it's gone. But why? Well, no one knows, but I think it's because of the lack of the community that supports that microbe. So I would maybe in a few years we'll say, all right, don't get the Reuteri, get Reuteri with these 6 other species, and it will take up permanent residence. But we don't know what that looks like just yet.
Do you have somebody on your team doing doing analysis of the microbiome post? I mean, is that something you guys have explored so far at this point?
We will in our next clinical trial. We'll do full DNA sequencing, baseline and follow-up to see what shifts occur. Because there probably are. That may give us a hint what that community looks like. Maybe it needs a specific proportion of Fecalibacterium or Lactospiraceae or some other. I just don't know. We haven't done that yet.
Are you familiar with Dr. Sabine Hazen in the West? She's on the West Coast, but
Is she the one doing a lot of the fecal transplants?
she does fecal transplants, but they have a research facility as well. They're the ones that found out during COVID. She took a lot of flack for this, that the people post jabby jab got a decimation of bifidobacteria, and that was what she suspected was part of the problem. and that by giving high dose vitamin C, you saw a return
Hmm.
of Bifidobacter species. And so they were testing that pre-post. She was running samples on people, but I just thought if you have somebody on your team, great. But if you didn't, she might be a good introduction to make to you if you don't know her to because she's got a lab, and this might be a topic that she could help you with as well.
Oh, great thought. I hadn't heard that with the vitamin C. We have seen the Taiwan data that showed that with COVID, not the vaccine, with COVID itself, there's a depletion of bifidobacteria species. And we've had some good success in the long COVID people, having them get bifidobacteria, either probiotics and or yogurts. Bifidobacteria also make good yogurts.
Yeah. So how are you making your yogurts? What's your base ingredients? Walk us through, the person watching this, if they want to use your Reuteri and make some yogurt, how do they go about that?
So you'll need the microbe. So I formulate those products in part to provide the microbe to people. The My Reuteri or the Gut to Glow either can be used. And so you need a minimum of 2 billion to start. So you'll have more than enough of any of those things. So 2 billion microbes, put it in a bowl. I like to add prebiotic fiber. It's kind of like adding cow manure to your vegetable garden. You're going to have bigger tomatoes and cucumbers. So add a tablespoon of a prebiotic fiber like inulin, which is very easy to get. We make a slurry, add a couple tablespoons. I use half and half organic, half and half, because I reject this whole idea of cutting fat and cholesterol. So add a little bit of the half and half, stir it, make sure all the clumps are broken up, then top it off with the rest of the half and half, cover it, and then keep it at human body temperature, around 98 to 100 degrees thereabouts, in your sous vide, in your yogurt maker, in your Instant Pot, or whatever device you have, for 36 hours, covered. And after 36 hours, you got this super duper rich, thick yogurt. Now, sometimes the first batch likes to separate, and it's the subsequent batch is made from a little of the prior batch. It's kind of like having a garden. If I give you a tomato and you plant tomatoes, those seeds to make tomatoes, at the end of the season, you save a tomato for the seeds for next year. Same thing here. We make a batch, save a little of this batch to use for the next batch. A couple of tablespoons is all you need to get started for the next batch. So you'll have to purchase the microbes once, never have to purchase them again. And this is true for most lactobacillus species, most bifidobacteria species. There's some other species you can ferment also. The only thing to know about it helped if your listeners get into the whole world of fermenting things, it helps to understand microbes and have them fall in two different categories. Human body temperature fermenting microbes like lactobacillus and bifidobacteria. Then there's room temperature fermenting microbes. Those are the species that ferment cabbage, kimchi, sauerkraut, fermented veggies. Those are different species. Leuconostoc, Weissella, Pediococcus. Very different, but still, by the way, very beneficial, extremely beneficial to have those fermented foods. But those can be fermented at room temperature typically.
Okay. So you just use a half and half, organic half and half, and add a couple billion, 2 billion, and then it's a 36-hour wait.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Now, if there's some variation with some microbes, like for instance, there can be like Lactobacillus plantarum, which is a very versatile species. You can get by with 90 degrees at 24 hours. So I do. People don't want to look through the microbiological literature to figure this out. So I put it in the Super Gut book, like a recipe book. What I did there was I said things like this. If you want better skin, better well-being, ferment Lactobacillus reuteri. If you want a smaller waist, ferment Lactobacillus gasseri. If you want to recover from strenuous exercise because you're a competitive athlete or you have hard physical labor, let's ferment Bacillus coagulans. If you want a healthier baby who benefits more from human breast milk, let's ferment, make sure that child has Bifidobacterium infantis. If you are a woman who's struggling with urinary tract infections and incontinence and vaginal infections, let's ferment Lactobacillus crispatus. In other words, you can pick and choose, at least until we get a better way to restore everything that's missing. Until that happens, we kind of pick and choose the microbes we want for the effect we want.
Gotcha. What's your advice on let's just take somebody who's just trying to maintain a really good, healthy microbiome. And I know you're famous for, I think most famous for your book Wheat Belly. But what's your just general guidance or advice for someone who we want to maintain a good, healthy microbiome, and whether we're adding, L. reuteri or gas rye or bacillus or whatever it might be, how do we avoid that as we walk through life? What are your top tips to avoid like detriment to your microbiome? Beyond the obvious, you mentioned chlorine and fluoride in the water. You mentioned, antibiotic use. Are there other things that you would guide people to say, hey, preserve your microbiome by doing these things?
We have to kind of go back to real foods that don't have preservatives, emulsifying agents, other additives, because those are all disruptive on the gastrointestinal microbiome. So people don't have to remember that you should avoid polysorbate 80, for instance, in ice cream. But go back to foods that don't have labels, go back to foods that don't have risk of additives, an avocado, pork, foods that are as close to their basic form as possible. Once you allow a manufacturer to add stuff, it could be carboxymethylcellulose, it could be BHT. Rather than memorize that list, we go back to just whole, real foods, organic, of course, whenever possible, minus herbicides and pesticides. The other thing is lots and lots of fermented foods. The interesting thing about fermented foods, so let's say you have some kimchi or sauerkraut, or maybe you fermented some cherry tomatoes and garlic and eggplant on your kitchen counter. So easy. You can either use, by the way, microbes resident on the surface of that vegetable, but it's much easier to use a starter culture. Here's an easy workaround. Buy or obtain some sauerkraut or other fermented food. Take some of the brine. It's like fermented pickles from the store. Make sure it's fermented, of course. Take some of the brine, add that to your chopped veggies immersed in saline. It has to be salt water, filtered water, no chlorine, and non-iodized salt also. So pour that brine from that commercial product into your mixture of fermented veggies and let them ferment on your kitchen counter for days to weeks. And so it's very inexpensive. But the crazy thing about fermented foods is the species of fermented foods, like the ones I mentioned, Leuconostoc mesenteroides or Pediococcus pentasaceus. No one has to remember that. Those microbes don't take up residence in the human GI tract. You consume them, say, as sauerkraut, they pass right through you. But they provide benefit in that they feed beneficial microbes and cause them to proliferate. So you'll get more lactobacillus species, you'll get more Akkermansia, more Fecalibacterium, all the beneficial species that have all kinds of wonderful effects. So fermented foods are extremely important, even though they themselves don't take up residence. Those microbes don't take up residence. They feed. They're kind of like farmers. They cultivate things for you.
Interesting. So not even necessarily trying to populate your gut, just trying to get the benefits of the bacteria in the food that nourish the gut and keep what's supposed to be there healthier overall. Yeah. Have you found, working with bacteria that there are certain things that really work against that? I mean, in a big way. So like if you were to say, these are the top 5 things, never do this, like ever. And I know that's maybe a tough question because, that's but anyway, I'm going to ask it anyway. What are your top 5? Don't do this. Don't do these things, or try to avoid these things as much as humanly possible.
Antibiotics. So there's a time and place where we have to. If you have pneumococcal pneumonia and you're on a ventilator, you need an antibiotic.
Yeah,
If
yeah.
you have a Staphylococcus aureus abscess, so you got to take an antibiotic. But what you don't need antibiotics for is you have a little cough and a runny nose, a viral upper respiratory. You don't need an antibiotic. So, as you know, antibiotics are widely overprescribed. It's not uncommon for most people by age 40 to have taken 30 some rounds of antibiotics. For every 1,000 children, 1,300 prescriptions for antibiotics are written every year. So there's wild overuse. So minimize your reliance on antibiotics. That's a big factor. Other drugs, stomach acid blocking drugs, which so many people take, Acifex, Protonix, Prilosec, those kind of drugs. Those because they turn off the production of stomach acid. Well, stomach acid is essential. They prevent oral microbes from colonizing your GI tract. They prevent fecal microbes from coming up from the colon. Well, without stomach acid, you're a sitting duck, and you're going to have a stomach, duodenum, and jejunum filled with oral and fecal microbes. So that's real important. Get off those stupid drugs. Likewise, nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, these are like ibuprofen, naproxen, Sulindac. Those likewise are massively disrupted and increase intestinal permeability, allowing bacterial breakdown products to enter the bloodstream. And in the food additives, one of the most harmful foods you can eat is ice cream. All crazy things because, not because the manufacturers are evil. They might be, but most of the time it's because they're just ignorant. And they don't want you to have the ice cream thaw and then you refreeze it. You know what happens, right? It turns into a ball of ice and solid. It's disgusting. So they add polysorbate 80, carboxymethylcellulose, carrageenan, xanthan gum, multiple ingredients to prevent separation of the ice cream. And yet that emulsifies your mucus barrier in your gastrointestinal tract. Another one is Miralax. That is the common prep. Isn't this shocking? So your gastroenterologist says, here, take the Miralax for your colonoscopy prep. Essentially saying, take this factor that massively disrupts your gastrointestinal microbiome and dissolves the protective mucus barrier in your GI tract, and you won't recover for days. And if you take it chronically for constipation, you'll likely get colon cancer. So in the effort to identify polyps and early colon cancer, they're going to give you something that causes colon cancer. This is the kind of thing that goes on in conventional healthcare.
Yeah, I just had somebody last week that was the 2-year-long solution for the bowel problem, and as opposed to doing they didn't want him to go on a gluten-free diet. But whatever you do, don't go on a gluten-free diet. That's dangerous. But take this Miralax for the next 2 years, and you'll have regular bowel movements. Interesting. Yeah. So you mentioned stomach acid blocking medicines and nonsteroidal anti-inflammatories as being disruptive of the gut. And you mentioned food gums. So like the carrageenan gum, xanthan gum, polysorbate. These things can be found though in toothpaste as well. And they can be found and not even just necessarily things that you think about eating, right? I mean, so anyway, so don't do those things. Eat more fermented foods. If you want to make your own yogurt, they can get Reuteri. We'll put the links to your stuff down below for people. And you got to ferment the way you do it is full cream or half and half for 36 hours at body temperature, right? At body temperature, and then that you've measured that to be approximately, you said, I think, correct my memory, was it 100 billion or was it more colony forming units?
It tends a bullseye around 300 billion per half cup.
300 billion per half cup. So, and that's if you have SIBO, SIFO, and you're looking to support that. But then beyond that, don't necessarily, not really needing that 300 billion every day, correct? I mean, you found that the SIBO, the SIFO is, how long are they taking it where they're finding the relief? Is it 30 days, 60 days?
Usually 30 days. An occasional person who has it really bad. There's some people who say things like, I took antibiotics for 3 years solid for acne or something like that. Those people typically have to do it 2, 3, sometimes more months.
Okay.
And it is an ongoing effort too. And don't know why. If you've had SIBO once, you're probably going to struggle to keep it from coming back for the rest of your life until we find better answers.
Yeah, I think we're going to learn in the next 10 to 20 years, we're going to learn so much more about the human microbiome.
I cringe, don't you? To think how things were before we started paying attention to the microbiome. Oh, we were helpless.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I'd say go back long enough, we didn't really need to worry about the microbiome because we had lifestyles that were so conducive of keeping
Good point. Good point.
Do you see or have you done any analysis of babies born cesarean versus vaginal delivery where they're more prone to Reuteri deficiency or any data that you've seen on that from
Yeah,
from
not my data, other people's data, but you're right, is absolutely crystal clear. Children who are born vaginally, even vaginal delivery is no guarantee, right? Because I have two relatively new grandchildren, about 1 and 2 years old, and mom got multiple rounds of antibiotics, baby got multiple rounds of antibiotics, so they start out impaired, and so, but you're right, there's stark differences. Children born vaginally have a microbiome that mimics the vaginal microbiota of the mom and needs to be enriched in Bifidobacterium infantis. That's a really interesting situation. So it's clear that newborns in the first year of life should have their microbiomes dominated by this one species, very different from adults, Bifidobacterium infantis, because that microbe allows the child to benefit from the metabolism of so-called human milk oligosaccharides. These are specific nutrients that comes from breast milk. And if the child lacks Bifidobacterium infantis, it cannot metabolize those nutrients. And it has impaired neurological maturation. It's more prone to asthma, type 1 diabetes, autoimmune diseases, more likely to become an obese type 2 diabetic as a teenager, and will have a lower IQ. I mean, so crucial for a child to get this microbe and breastfeed. It does no good to get that microbe if you're going to formula feed, because formula is such a corrupt product in general. It has essentially none of so many things, omega-3 fatty acids. I mean, trivial quantities. Likewise, human milk oligosaccharides. Some brands do put some in, but the quantity is so trivial as to be laughable. So there's that. And the children who are born by C-section tend to have the microbes of the hospital. And we know that hospitals are disgusting. They're filled, not because the hospital people are bad, but because sick people are there. Sick people have intravenous lines that get infected, and people have pathogens. They're there because they're sick. And so hospitals are disgusting hotbeds of pathogens like methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus and pathogenic species of Staphylococcus epidermidis that should be a benign microbe, but they're dangerous in hospitals. So the child, because nurses, hospital surfaces, the air, a lot of these microbes are aerosolized. That child leaves with a hospital microbiome. So stark differences, C-section versus vaginal delivery.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that about formula. We had that formula shortage not very long ago, and I was like, hallelujah, there's a formula shortage. Hopefully there will be some women that find alternatives that are better, or maybe they made the choice not to breastfeed for whatever personal reason they were making, and maybe that helped them to make the choice in the other direction. But
And you know what? Having mom get Lactobacillus reuteri and thereby oxytocin causes an increase in the capacity to breastfeed because it's oxytocin that causes expression of breast milk, and it's oxytocin that cultivates the maternal-infant bond. So ladies who don't have reuteri, less likely to breastfeed successfully and more prone to postpartum depression, which is a very, very bad thing to experience.
interesting. Yeah, oxytocin. Boy, it goes back to that oxytocin. So we've said oxytocin is the love and tolerance hormone. You mentioned the weight changes. Any other effects that oxytocin has that the audience should know about?
In the mouse models, there's if healing time was supposed to be 10 days of a wound, it's abbreviated to 5 days. In humans, it's more like 7 days. It's not quite as vigorous as in mice. There's that. I think we're going to find that there's tons of things we didn't know about. For instance, the heart. The heart is filled with oxytocin receptors. They've got to be there for a reason. If we get a restoration of skeletal muscle with oxytocin, how about heart muscle? I've seen hints of that anecdotally, but no one's done the clinical trials yet to show that could reuteri thereby oxytocin be a means of strengthening heart muscle, which, as you know, is a terrible area. It's filled with horrible devices and drugs that are only partially effective, like after a heart attack or have other diseases of heart muscle, like a cardiomyopathy. I think oxytocin, Reuteri oxytocin, are going to prove to be very instrumental. I have a friend, for instance, this is pure anecdote, and healthy woman, and just went in for a routine EKG, and she had a new left bundle branch block, meaning a major short circuit in her heart. And it turned out she had an episode of myocarditis, a viral myocarditis, a viral infection of her heart several months earlier that laid her up in bed. And so her heart muscle was dramatically impaired. So she had what's called a dilated cardiomyopathy. Her heart, rather than squeezing vigorously, does this. It doesn't squeeze properly. And that's a real dangerous situation. And she developed this conduction defect in her electrical system, the left bundle branch block. Those things don't go away. Well, she's put on multiple drugs, anticoagulants. They're talking about pacemakers and defibrillators. They were even talking about what's called a biventricular pacemaker, one on the left side, one on the right side to bring the heart back in synchrony. Because when you had that conduction defect, that bundle branch block, the heart doesn't contract. It's out of sync. So they're talking. Oh, I said to my friend, hey, make the yogurt. There's nothing to lose here. It's just stinking yogurt, right? Here, I gave her the micro. Here, make it. She makes it. She calls me like 2, 3 months later. She said, you know what? The left bundle branch block is gone. It reverted back, which never happens. I've never seen it ever happen before. And my ejection fraction, that's how a measure of the heart strength. Normally 55%, 60%. She was down to 30%, 25, 30%. It was back into the 50 plus range. Things are not supposed to happen, but it happened. That's one case. It proves nothing, but I think it's a hint that oxytocin could be one of the most major discoveries in heart health.
Very interesting. Well, I mean, that's amazing. Anecdote is where research begins, right? I mean, it's the observation of astute physicians that say, hey, this is happening. Maybe some of you PhD guys ought to start taking a look at this. So that's quite amazing. So have you thought or given any thought to or read anything in the research about Reuteri creating fermentation of foods that lead to the production of vitamins like vitamin B1 for heart health, the classic beriberi congestive heart failure problem associated with B1 deficiency. And we know the microbiome as an example, biotin, I think it's 50-60% of our daily need for biotin is derived from microbes in the gut, and K1, 50% of that is derived from microbes in the gut. Have you seen anything specifically with Reuteri and its capacity for the production of vitamins for human hosts?
The only vitamin I'm aware of that is vigorously produced by Reuteri is B12. So it produced a lot of B12. But you make an excellent point. That is, we know that microbes, a variety of different species, are capable of manufacturing significant quantities of B1, B2, B3, B5, B6, B7, B9, and B12, and K2. So we know that so much. I think about that because, pregnant moms are told to get folic acid through grain products like bread and cereals. But of course, the real solution is probably just restore the microbiome so that they produce folates for you, and you don't need to rely on those synthetic sources from garbage foods. So I think there's a lot of that we're going to have. I think homocysteine, for instance. We know that homocysteine, particularly blood levels above 14 micromolar, increase risk for cancer, depression, and heart disease and stroke. And so there have been now, to my knowledge, 8 clinical trials, large trials, where people were given some combination of vitamin B6, folate, B9, B12, sometimes riboflavin, and there's a reduction in homocysteine, but no improvement in health, no reduction in risk for anything. So I think what's happening is that what they're trying to do is treat a marker for dysbiosis or SIBO. That it's the loss of microbes that produce those B vitamins that is really the cause. And just by giving B vitamins, you don't address the whole risk. You got to address the microbiome. I think that's where that conversation is going.
Yeah, I wish I had a time machine. I could jump ahead 10 or 15 years to see where it's at. Well, this has been an amazing conversation, enlightening. Are you working on anything new right now? You mentioned a foundation for research. Any new books in the chute?
I have a book coming out in about a year. The publishers have been very, very slow, and I can't tell the title because we're having a very heated argument about what the title will be. So I should have it in a couple of months or so. But the tentative title, if I get my way, is Bulge. It sounds very offensive. I'm sorry, but it's about body shape and composition. Bulges like that.
Yeah.
So that I hope comes out is that not the silly title they're trying to get, but that
Yeah, you got to play the game. Yeah.
I wish you and I, yeah, you look younger than I am, but I wish I was 25 again because you know what? Just Reuteri and oxytocin alone is a career's worth of investigation and work. There's so much here. There's other things, of course, but just working on Reuteri and oxytocin, all its wonderful effects, this thing we've lost, is enough to occupy an entire career.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, especially in today's world where I can remember, I mean, I'm 52. So when I was in grad school, you didn't have Google search. You had microfiche. If you wanted to dig into the literature, it was okay, you find that stuff. And then you climb the ladder in the library that, blow the dust off the top of the book and you pull out the, maybe 20 journal copies are in this year's, version of American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. And you pull that volume off the shelf and you run to the photocopier. And, now we have so much research. It's accelerated at such a great pace. And as you said, just L-Reuteri alone could be a career. It could be an entire lifetime study. But now we're expected as doctors, we're expected to know that, and then we're expected to learn all these other things that are just escalating in knowledge at breakneck speed. I'm really thankful for artificial intelligence, for its research applications, for its ability to summarize and gather and collect data for us, so that because it's an overwhelming task, isn't it? Or it can be.
I remember those days. Dusting off those old journals. I remember that. Yeah, you're right. So much faster now.
Yeah, for sure. So your book's coming out maybe next year, Bulge, if you get your way. Where can people find you now if they want to learn more about L-Reuteri and what you're doing?
So there's the products, My Reuteri or Gut to Glow. It falls under the oxyceutics.com, oxi-ceutics.com. Also, my websites, williamdavismd.com is where my blog is housed, several thousand articles. I have a membership website. It's got the awful name of innercircle.drdavisinfinitehealth.com, where people who want more engagement, want to participate in this. A lot of what we're doing is crowdsourcing of wisdom. We're learning new lessons from each other. I learn from you, you learn from me, we learn from our audiences, they learn from us. And it's accelerated the pace of discovery. For instance, Reuteri and its effects on sleep. This was never described in any clinical trial. It's something we stumbled on as a group. Not everybody experienced that, by the way, but many of us do as chronic insomniacs enjoying deep sleep, never before described, but comes out in this wonderful experience of crowdsourced wisdom.
Yeah, that's amazing. I love technology for that reason right there. Okay, well, I'm going to put your links below our video today. Dr. Davis, thanks so much for spending time with me and sharing your knowledge and wisdom and just being a fantastic mentor in the world of functional, integrative, alternative medicine and having the courage to speak about it. So many doctors that I've met at conferences will talk about it all day long with a closed door, but they're very reticent to talk about it with an open microphone and with an open heart. So I really do appreciate, your body of work and your dedication to helping people find answers.
Dr. Osborne, always a pleasure. Always glad to come back and keep doing what you're doing.
Will do. All right. I look forward to our future conversations. Thanks for tuning in to the Dr. Osborne Zone. Don't forget to share, like, and subscribe for more content like this, and make sure you come back next Tuesday at 6 p.m. Central Standard Time and Thursday at noon 30 for more episodes.